Army veteran stands trial when his name is called. Everyone rises. The federal courthouse in New York City was packed that Thursday morning. Colonel Richard Anderson, 68 years old with over 4 decades of dedicated service to the United States Army, waited silently for the session to begin. One that could destroy not only his reputation but the entire legacy he had built over a lifetime. The light streaming through the courthouse's tall windows reflected off the impeccably aligned medals on his uniform, each representing moments of bravery and devotion to his country. Richard kept his shoulders perfectly straight, a posture decades of military discipline had made second nature, even now, as his heart raced under the weight of the charges. When Judge Robert Collins entered the room, everyone rose as usual. The magistrate adjusted his robe and announced the start of the session, his gaze fixed on the veteran. Case number 47582, the District Attorney's Office versus Colonel Richard Robert Anderson for alleged misappropriation of funds intended for the Veterans Memorial. A murmur swept through the room. The judge banged his gavel for silence and then formally declared, "Let the defendant, Colonel Richard Robert Anderson, recipient of the Medal of Military Merit, the Peacekeeper Medal," and before he could finish, something extraordinary happened. Every person in the courtroom stood up in near-perfect unison. This wasn't the customary respect shown to the judge. It was something different, deeper. The silence was deafening. The judge, visibly unsettled, scanned the room in confusion. "What is happening here?" he asked, perplexed by the spontaneous display. A man around 70 years old, leaning on a cane, stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'm Frank Miller, former sergeant. I served under Colonel Anderson during the New Orleans floods of 1983. He saved not just my life but dozens of families when no one else came." Colonel Richard remained stoic, his face etched with the years and burdens he had carried. His crisp blue uniform contrasted with his weary expression. The medals on his chest caught the light from the courthouse windows. "Order in the court," the judge demanded, striking his gavel. "I understand the respect, but this is a formal trial. Please, everyone, be seated." Reluctantly, the crowd sat back down, but the atmosphere had shifted. Prosecutor Sarah Johnson, a stern middle-aged woman, seemed uneasy about the show of support for the defendant. "Your Honor," she began, adjusting her glasses, "despite the evident respect the defendant has earned throughout his career, we are here to judge facts, and the facts are clear. $5 million allocated for the Veterans Memorial in Fort Bragg were redirected to unidentified accounts under Colonel Anderson's direct supervision." In the front row of the gallery, a woman in her 40s watched with sharp, troubled eyes. Emily Anderson Parker, the colonel's only daughter, had cut ties with her father over 15 years ago. Now she was here, not for reconciliation, but out of a sense of duty he had instilled in her since childhood. Emily remembered their last big fight, when she announced she wouldn't pursue the military career he had always expected of her, choosing instead to study business. "Business?" Richard had repeated, incredulous. "5 generations of our family have served in the army, and you want to manage companies?" "I don't want to spend my life taking orders without question, Dad," she had shot back defiantly. "Or giving orders without being questioned." His face hardened, that expression she knew so well. The mask of an officer hiding any emotion that could be seen as weakness. "You don't understand anything about service, Emily. Because you never explained, you never let me into that part of your life. It was always, that's army business, or you wouldn't understand. How can I understand if you never let anyone get close?" That had been the last real conversation they'd had. Afterward, there were only brief exchanges on birthdays and holidays until her mother passed away, and the silence became complete. And now in the courthouse, Emily couldn't help but notice how her father seemed smaller, more fragile, despite his impeccable posture. Time had not been kind to him. Or, perhaps she thought with a pang of guilt, her absence had not been kind to him. The defense attorney, Dr. Thomas Wright, stood calmly, a man in his 50s, known for his meticulousness and for only taking cases he believed in. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to make it clear that my client vehemently denies all charges, and that we will present compelling evidence of his innocence. Colonel Anderson dedicated his life to serving this nation. It's absurd to even suggest he could betray the principles he upheld for over 40 years. The trial continued with the presentation of the charges. Documents were displayed showing bank transfers authorized by the colonel, seemingly without legal justification. With each new piece of evidence presented by the prosecution, Richard's expression remained unchanged, as if carved in stone. During the recess, Emily approached her father for the first time, still maintaining a palpable emotional distance. "I didn't think you'd come," said the colonel, his deep voice carrying the weight of years without contact. "I didn't either," she replied curtly. "I'm not here for you. I'm here because I want to hear the truth from your mouth. Did you embezzle that money?" Richard looked at his daughter, the same determined eyes as his late wife, Margaret, who had passed 10 years earlier. For a moment, he was transported to the past, to an autumn afternoon when Margaret had confronted him with that same gaze. "Richard, you promised Emily you'd be at her recital today," Margaret had said, clutching the phone to her chest after his call, cancelling yet another family commitment. "Margaret, you know I can't leave those families without support. John passed away yesterday. His widow is desperate with 3 young children. And your daughter. She needs you too. She practiced that piece for weeks. For you." He remembered the silence that followed, the weight of the impossible choice he'd made so many times. Margaret never yelled, never accused him outright, but that look, the same one he now saw in Emily, carried all the disappointment words couldn't express. Returning to the present, Richard sighed. "You've already decided I'm guilty. Haven't you, Emily? It's always been this way, never giving me a chance to explain." "Explanations?" Emily's voice trembled slightly. "Like the ones you never gave when you cancelled our family trips, or when you didn't show up at Mom's graduation because you had important matters to handle. Do you know how many times I had to hear from her, 'Your father really wanted to be here,' while seeing the sadness in her eyes?" Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. "Your mother understood my duty," Richard replied, his voice quieter. "She accepted it. She didn't understand. There's a difference." Emily stepped back as she saw the attorney approaching to speak with her father. Meanwhile, in the courthouse hallway, a man observed everything intently. Major Brian Foster, the colonel's former subordinate and now in charge of financial administration at the Veterans Memorial, was the primary whistleblower in the case. At 50 years old, Brian harbored an ambition he had never been able to fulfill under the strict and incorruptible command of Anderson. "How are you feeling now, Colonel?" asked Dr. Thomas Wright, sitting beside his client. "Like a soldier about to face a battle I've trained for my whole life, but with weapons I don't recognize," replied Richard, looking down at his own aged hands. "I have news. We managed to locate the parallel records you mentioned, but we'll need more time to organize the defense properly. I'll request a postponement." No postponements. I want this settled today." Back in the courtroom, the session resumed with Brian Foster's testimony. With rehearsed confidence, the Major presented documents, emails, and reports that, according to him, proved the misallocation of funds. Colonel Anderson had complete control over where the money went. "When I questioned some unusual transfers, I was warned and told to follow orders." Brian paused dramatically. "Advanced age and a service record shouldn't shield anyone from accountability for corruption." The judge then allowed the defense to cross-examine the witness. Dr. Thomas stood calmly. "Major Foster, you mentioned being warned when you questioned transfers. Could you please show the court these formal warnings?" Brian hesitated briefly. "They were verbal warnings, Doctor." "I see. And why didn't you report this to the authorities immediately after these alleged conversations?" "I respected the colonel. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt for a few months." Months that conveniently coincided with the period. "You were being considered for promotion to lieutenant colonel, correct? A promotion that didn't happen because Colonel Anderson refused to recommend you, citing, I quote the official reports, excessive ambition and questionable ethical judgment." Brian's face flushed with anger. His hands gripped the edge, Carve the witness stand hard enough to turn his knuckles white. The colonel always had favorites, he replied, his voice tight. I was too competent, questioned things when necessary. He preferred subordinates who just said yes, sir, without thinking. Major Foster, could you tell us about the incident in Puerto Rico in 2018? Dr. Thomas abruptly changed the subject. Brian visibly paled. I don't see how that's relevant to this case. Your Honor, the incident demonstrates a pattern of behavior directly relevant to the witness's credibility, argued the lawyer. The judge nodded. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Major. Brian swallowed hard. There was a disagreement about resource allocation for a humanitarian aid operation after the floods. A disagreement? Dr. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Records show you were formally reprimanded for attempting to redirect medical supplies to non-priority areas against direct orders from then Colonel Anderson, who was coordinating the operation. Areas that, curiously, had national media coverage. I believed we were neglecting important communities, Brian exclaimed, momentarily losing his composure. Or perhaps you were more concerned with your media image than the operation's efficiency. Isn't it true that after this incident, Colonel Anderson included that note about your questionable ethical judgment in your evaluation? Before Brian could respond, the courtroom door opened and an elderly woman entered, leaning on the arm of a young man who looked barely in his 20s. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, said the young man. My name is Michael Anderson, grandson of Colonel Richard Anderson. This is Mrs. Dorothy Wilson, former Administrative Secretary of the Army Property Management Division. The judge, intrigued, allowed them to approach. Mrs. Dorothy, nearly 80 years old, carried an old briefcase. Young man, why wasn't this lady included in the witness list? The judge questioned. Because we only found her yesterday, Your Honor. Mrs. Dorothy learned about the trial from the newspaper and reached out to us. Your Honor, this is outrageous, protested Prosecutor Sarah Johnson. We can't accept last-minute witnesses. The judge considered for a moment before deciding, I'll allow her to speak, but her testimony will be evaluated with due caution. Please, ma'am, come forward. Mrs. Dorothy, with slow but determined steps, walked to the witness stand. After taking the oath, she looked directly at the colonel and smiled kindly. I've known Colonel Anderson for over 30 years. I worked in the Army's financial administration until my retirement in 2015. During all that time, I was responsible for recording special documentation, including classified projects. She opened the briefcase and pulled out a set of yellowed documents. These are the parallel records of the Guardians project, exceptionally approved by the High Command in 2010, a project to assist families of military personnel in extreme vulnerability without the exposure that could harm their careers. The entire courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor stepped forward to examine the documents. And what does this have to do with the Veterans Memorial? She asked skeptically. The memorial served as legal cover for the project's continuation after budget cuts. Colonel Anderson himself supplemented the funds with a significant portion of his salary and pension. The defense attorney intervened. Your Honor, these documents prove there was no embezzlement, but rather an authorized redirection within a classified Army project. Prosecutor Sarah flipped through the documents with growing frustration. Even if this Guardians project existed, it doesn't justify using funds allocated for the memorial without transparency or formal approval. If I may, Colonel Anderson's voice rang out in the courtroom for the first time. Grave, firm, but weary. The Guardians project was never officially recorded for one simple reason: to protect the dignity of our soldiers. How do you explain to a proud soldier that after serving his country, he can't support his family? How do we officially document that we have veterans living in dire conditions? The judge watched with increasing interest. Colonel, are you saying you deliberately diverted funds? I'm saying, Your Honor, that I followed superior orders to maintain the secrecy of a relief operation, and when official funds were cut, I continued the work with what I had available. At that moment, Michael, the colonel's grandson, approached his lawyer again and whispered something. Dr. Thomas Wright seemed surprised. Your Honor, I've just been informed of something relevant to this case. Young Michael has alerted me that while researching the judge assigned to this trial, he discovered that Your Honor is the son of Captain Frank Mitchell, who served under Colonel Anderson's command in the 80s. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Robert Collins paled slightly. That is true, the judge admitted, visibly unsettled. My father served in the 12th Infantry Battalion, but he passed away when I was a child. I didn't make the connection to the defendant's name. In that case, Your Honor, we must request your recusal due to a potential conflict of interest. The judge seemed conflicted, but nodded. You're right. I'll recuse myself. This case will be reassigned to another judge, and today's hearing is suspended. The news of the trial's suspension spread quickly. As people left the courthouse, Emily approached her father again, who was talking to his grandson Michael. So that's it? Another delay, another escape through bureaucratic loopholes? She asked, bitterness in her voice. It's not an escape, Emily, Richard replied firmly. It's the proper procedure. Always the procedure, the duty, the protocol. She shook her head. You know what I still don't understand? Why everyone stood up when they mentioned your name. What did you do to earn such respect when you could? Never be there for your own family? The colonel didn't answer immediately. He looked at his grandson, then at his daughter, and finally at the people still lingering in the courthouse, many of whom watched him with clear admiration. Maybe. One day you'll understand, he said at last. Or maybe I failed to explain what truly matters. As they left the courthouse, a group of reporters waited outside. Among them stood Linda Parker, an investigative journalist known for her persistence. Colonel Anderson, can you comment on the allegations? Is it true you misused public funds? Before he could answer, the colonel felt a sharp pain in his chest. His vision darkened momentarily and he staggered. Michael and Dr. Thomas rushed to support him. Grandpa, the young man exclaimed, alarmed. I'm fine, Richard murmured, slowly recovering. I just need to rest for a bit. Emily, despite her resentment, couldn't hide her concern. You need to go to the hospital now. I don't need a hospital, I need to go home. Dad, don't be stubborn. It was the first time in 15 years she had called him Dad. At the hospital, Dr. Vincent Morgan, the cardiologist who had treated the colonel for years, confirmed what Richard already knew. His heart condition had worsened significantly. Colonel, I warned you about stress. You need complete rest. Doctor, how much time do I have? Richard asked directly. The doctor hesitated, glancing briefly at Emily and Michael, who stood nearby. If you follow the treatment strictly and avoid any stress, a few years. Otherwise, I understand. Emily, who had overheard the conversation, felt a lump in her throat. As much as she wanted to keep her emotional distance, the possibility of losing her father stirred feelings she had tried to bury for years. When they were alone in the hospital room, she finally asked, How long have you known? 5 years, he answered simply. And you never thought to tell me? Why? You made it very clear you didn't want to be part of my life anymore. That's not fair, Dad. You know why I walked away. The silence that followed was broken by Michael's arrival, accompanied by an elegant woman around 65 years old. Grandpa, I brought Aunt Helen to see you. Helen Anderson, Richard's younger sister, approached the bed with tears in her eyes. My stubborn brother, always thinking you can carry the world on your shoulders. Helen. Richard smiled weakly. You didn't have to come. Of course I did. Just like I should have come months ago when I heard about this ridiculous case. Emily just told me everything. The colonel gave his daughter a questioning look, but she averted her gaze. Aunt Helen has been visiting me regularly these past few years, Emily explained. She's the one who told me about the trial. And why didn't you tell me about his health? Helen asked, disapproval in her tone. Because I didn't know. We're uncovering a lot of secrets today, aren't we, Dad? Helen sat on the edge of the bed and took her brother's hand. Richard, you need to tell her everything. It's not the time, Helen. If not now, when? Her voice grew firmer. Emily deserves to know the truth about the Guardians Project, about why you were never present. Emily looked from one to the other, confused. What is she talking about, Dad? Colonel Anderson closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When he opened them again, his gaze was different, more vulnerable than Emily had ever seen. The Guardians Project started after I visited the family of a sergeant who served with me. He had passed away on a mission. The widow and 3 children were living in terrible conditions. The system failed them. And that justifies your absence in our lives, Emily questioned, still resistant. No, nothing justifies it, but maybe it explains it. Richard paused. Your mother knew everything. In fact, it was her idea to create a support network for military families. Margaret dedicated as much time as I did to the project. Emily felt as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Mom, but why didn't she ever tell me? Because you saw her as a victim of my duty, and she preferred to keep that image rather than disappoint you, Richard replied, regret in his voice. Margaret was extraordinary like that. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, back to the story. All right, let's say, I believe this. Why keep the project a secret? Why not make it official? Emily asked, still skeptical. At first, it was to protect the family's dignity. Later, when the project grew, there were political complications. Funds meant for equipment being used for social assistance. Not everyone would approve. Helen stepped in. Emily, your father helped hundreds of families over the years. Children got to go to school. Widows had time to rebuild their lives. Veterans received care the government didn't provide. At the cost of his presence in his own family, Emily retorted, though her tone was less bitter. It was my choice, my failure, Richard admitted. I thought I could serve everyone and ended up neglecting those who mattered most. Meanwhile, as this conversation unfolded in the hospital, Major Brian Foster was far from satisfied with the trial's suspension. In his office at the Veterans Memorial Headquarters, he frantically searched through files, looking for anything he could use against the colonel, no matter which judge took over the case. There has to be something here, he muttered to himself. No one's as perfect as he seems. His phone rang. It was Prosecutor Sarah Johnson. Major, we need to talk. The documents presented by that woman, Mrs. Dorothy, seem authentic. Is there something you didn't tell me? Those papers prove nothing, Brian shot back defensively. Even if this so-called Guardians project existed officially, using memorial funds is still irregular. Irregular, yes, but with a very different context than what you presented. Why didn't you mention this project before? Because, Brian hesitated, because I never had full access to it. Anderson always kept it as his own private little kingdom. After hanging up, the Major felt cornered. If the case proceeded, and the true nature of the Guardians project came to light, his personal motives would be exposed. He decided he needed to take more drastic measures. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Dr. Vincent returned with a troubled expression. Colonel, I just got a strange call from the hospital's legal department. Apparently, someone is requesting your full medical records, claiming they're needed for a court case. Who would do that? Helen asked, outraged. I'm not sure, but the request mentions the memorial lawsuit. Richard understood immediately. Brian, he's trying to have me declared unfit to stand trial. That's outrageous, Emily exclaimed. He can't do that. Legally, if you can get a court order based on your father's health condition, then yes, it's possible, the doctor explained. But you'd need to prove it affects his mental capacity, which definitely isn't the case here. What does he gain from this? Michael asked, confused. Control, Richard replied. If I'm declared incompetent, the project would fall entirely into his hands. The families who depend on this support would be at the mercy of someone who doesn't care about them. Michael, who was studying law, had an idea. Grandpa, what if we brought some of those families to testify? Show the real purpose of the project? Colonel Anderson shook his head. No, those people have already been through enough hardship. I won't expose them to a media circus. But Dad, if you don't defend yourself properly, you could lose everything, Emily argued, surprising even herself with her change of heart. Some battles aren't won with large armies, my dear, but with precise strategy. The next day, while the colonel was still in the hospital, Michael visited Dr. Thomas Wright's office with a proposal. We need to change our approach. Instead of just defending against the accusations, let's officially present the Guardians project. Show the good it's done. Your grandfather already made it clear he doesn't want to expose the families, the lawyer reminded him. I'm not talking about exposing anyone. I'm talking about revealing the truth about the project, its goals and results, while keeping the beneficiaries anonymous. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Emily spent more time with her father. Years of resentment began giving way to a late understanding. One afternoon, as she watched him sleep, she found his personal journal in the bedside drawer. She hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. In the yellowed pages, she found detailed accounts of every family they'd helped, every child who received an education, every veteran who got medical care. And to her surprise, she found entries about herself, notes about school performances he couldn't attend, missed birthdays, the graduation he wasn't there for. Emily graduated. Today, I watched from afar where she couldn't see me. She looked so proud, so radiant. Margaret says she missed me but understood my absence. I doubt it. How could she understand what even I can't fully justify? Today we helped 3 families with the project, but I lost my daughter's smile. The price is too high. Tears rolled down Emily's face. All this time she had imagined a cold, distant father, obsessed with duty and indifferent to family. The reality was far more complicated. When Richard woke up, he found his daughter sitting beside his bed, holding the journal with red-rimmed eyes. "I shouldn't have read it," she said, embarrassed. "It was meant for you to read someday," he replied, surprising her. "I just never had the courage to give it to you. Why didn't you ever tell me how you felt? Why let me believe your work was more important? Because it was easier for you to hate me than to hate what I did. The work was necessary, Emily. Those families had no one else. And what about us, did we?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Meanwhile, Michael and Dr. Wright worked tirelessly on the new defense strategy. The young law student meticulously reviewed every document when he noticed something odd. "Doctor, look at this. These signatures on the documents submitted by Major Foster. They don't seem consistent with my grandfather's other signatures." The lawyer examined the papers carefully. "You're right. We need an urgent handwriting analysis." Back at the hospital, Emily received an unexpected visitor, Linda Parker, the journalist who had been present in court. "How did you get in here?" Emily asked defensively. "I'm persistent," replied the journalist with a weak smile. "I need to speak with your father. He's resting and won't be giving any interviews." "I'm not here for a regular interview." Linda lowered her voice. "I've been investigating Major Brian Foster for months. There's something much bigger behind these accusations against your father." Intrigued, Emily allowed the journalist to wait. When Richard woke up and was told about the visit, surprisingly, he agreed to speak with her. "Colonel Anderson, thank you for seeing me," Linda began. "I'll be direct. Major Foster is involved in a much larger scheme of seizing land meant for military facilities. The memorial and the alleged embezzlement are just part of the story." "Land?" The colonel seemed genuinely surprised. "Yes. The memorial was supposed to be built in a specific area, but Brian has been pushing for a relocation. Coincidentally, the new site he's proposing borders a major real estate project where he appears to have undisclosed interests." The revelation left everyone stunned. Emily was the first to speak. "How did you find this out?" "Basic investigative journalism and some sources within the construction company handling the real estate project," Linda explained. "The problem is, I need more concrete evidence before publishing." "Why are you telling us this?" Richard asked, studying the journalist's face carefully. "Because I believe in justice, Colonel, and because—" She hesitated briefly. "My father was one of the veterans helped by the Guardians project. He never knew who was behind the aid he received, but I found out during my investigation. The next day, the courthouse was even more crowded for the resumption of the trial. The newly assigned judge, Judge Catherine Williams, seemed extremely meticulous. "Before we proceed, I'd like to review all documents submitted so far," she declared, adjusting her glasses, "including records of the so-called Guardians project and the financial transfers related to the memorial." Major Brian, sitting beside the prosecutor, appeared restless. His eyes darted around the courtroom, occasionally settling on Richard, who had received medical clearance to attend, as long as he remained seated throughout the proceedings. That morning, before heading to court, Brian had received an unexpected call. On the other end, a distressed female voice. "Brian, it's Christine. I saw in the paper that the trial continues today. What's going on? He hesitated before answering. His ex-wife. I'm just doing my job, Christine. The colonel misused funds and someone has to hold him accountable. Is this really about justice? Her voice carried years of disappointment. Or is it about what happened in 2015? I don't know what you're talking about, he replied defensively. When we were broke after your father got sick, when you had to borrow money for his treatment. You never found out where that anonymous donation to the hospital came from, did you? Brian felt a chill run down his spine. What do you know about that? It was the Guardians Project. A social worker discreetly reached out to me after you'd refused official help 3 times. Your pride has always been bigger than your common sense, Brian. Are you saying Anderson? I'm saying you're prosecuting the man who saved your father's life. Think about that before you continue this vendetta. The call ended abruptly, leaving Brian with a sickening feeling that now, sitting in court, still haunted him. His eyes met Richard's briefly, and for the first time, there was something other than anger in his gaze. There was doubt. As the judge reviewed the documents, Dr. Thomas Wright requested permission to present new evidence. Your Honor, we request that these documents be included in the case file. This is a preliminary handwriting analysis of the signatures attributed to Colonel Anderson on the transfer documents. This is outrageous, protested the prosecutor. Are we presenting last-minute evidence again? The defense has the right to question the authenticity of the documents submitted by the prosecution, the judge responded calmly. I'll allow it, but I want to hear from the expert responsible for the analysis. The handwriting specialist was called and explained in detail how certain signatures attributed to the colonel showed significant inconsistencies, suggesting possible forgery. Objection, the prosecutor exclaimed. This is a desperate attempt to discredit solid evidence. The judge considered for a moment. I'll allow the full analysis to be conducted and attached to the case file. In the meantime, I'd like to hear from Colonel Anderson personally about the Guardians Project and his involvement with the memorial. Richard rose slowly, discreetly, supported by his lawyer, and approached the witness stand. After taking the oath, he began his testimony in a steady voice. The Guardians Project began in 1997, after I witnessed the dire situation of a soldier's family who had served under my command and passed away, leaving his wife and children without proper support. Initially, it was a personal effort, funded by me and a few fellow officers who shared the same concern. The courtroom listened in complete silence. By 2010, as the number of families we assisted grew, we secured informal approval from the High Command to expand the project, keeping it confidential to protect the dignity of those we helped. Most are proud veterans who wouldn't accept public charity or families of active duty soldiers who don't want financial struggles to affect their careers. He paused to catch his breath. When the Veterans Memorial proposal came up, I saw an opportunity to formalize part of the project. The idea was for the memorial to also serve as a support center for veterans and their families. The funds I transferred were to ensure the continuity of the assistance program while the memorial was being built. And why wasn't this officially documented? The judge asked. Because bureaucracy would delay the immediate help needed, and because there was resistance from those who preferred funds to go toward equipment and infrastructure. The prosecutor interjected, Colonel, are you admitting you deliberately diverted funds? I'm admitting I prioritized human lives over bureaucratic procedures, yes. Every cent transferred was used for the well-being of military families in need, and I have detailed records of every expense. At that moment, the courthouse doors opened, and a group of people entered. They were men and women of various ages, some in military uniforms, others in civilian attire. Michael, seated near the entrance, stood up with a smile. Your Honor, these people came voluntarily to testify about the Guardians Project. I know my grandfather didn't want to involve them, but they insisted when they heard about the trial. Major Foster visibly paled. Among the newcomers, he recognized several high-ranking officers, including retired generals. Surprised by the turn of events, the judge allowed a representative of the group to speak. A man around 70 years old, wearing a military uniform adorned with multiple decorations, stepped forward. I'm retired General William Thompson. I was one of the first to support the Guardians project when Colonel Anderson started it. I'm here to confirm that the High Command was aware of the project and its operations. If there was any failure, it was institutional in not properly formalizing an initiative that saved countless families. Other testimonies followed, each revealing different aspects of the project and how it had impacted lives. A teary-eyed woman shared how she was able to keep her children in school after losing her husband in a mission. A young officer recounted how his own family had been helped during his childhood, never knowing who was behind that assistance. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. During the testimonies, journalist Linda Parker discreetly entered the courthouse and handed an envelope to Dr. Thomas Wright, who quickly examined it before passing it to Michael. The young man read the contents and his eyes widened. When the testimonies concluded, Dr. Thomas requested permission to present additional evidence. Your Honor, we've just received information confirming that Major Brian Foster has direct financial interests in relocating the Veterans Memorial. Documents show his involvement in a shell company tied to the real estate project that would benefit from the new location. Major Brian abruptly stood up. This is slander. You have no right to make these baseless accusations. Your Honor, I can assure you we have substantial evidence, Dr. Thomas stated, displaying the documents. Furthermore, preliminary handwriting analysis indicates that Colonel Anderson's signatures on the transfer documents, which supposedly proved the misappropriation, were forged. The courtroom erupted in chaos. The judge repeatedly banged her gavel, calling for order. Silence. This is a significant development. Major Foster, given these allegations, do you have anything to say? Cornered, Brian looked around like a trapped animal. Without a word, he tried to head for the exit, but was intercepted by 2 courthouse security officers. This amounts to a confession, the judge declared. Major Foster is detained for further investigation. As for the case against Colonel Richard Anderson, I must review all this new evidence before making a ruling. The session was adjourned for an hour. During the break, in the courthouse hallway, Richard was surrounded by former comrades in arms and families helped by the project. Emily Parker watched from a distance, processing everything she'd learned about her father in recent days. A little girl, about 10 years old, timidly approached the colonel. "Are you Uncle Richard?" she asked. "My grandma always talks about you. She says you're an angel without wings." Richard smiled, visibly moved. "And who's your grandmother?" "Sweetheart, Mrs. Louise. She said you paid for my school when my daddy got sick." Emily stepped closer, just in time to see tears in her father's eyes, something she'd never witnessed before. "I'm glad you're in school," Richard replied softly. "Your grandmother is a very strong woman." As the little girl walked away, Emily sat beside her father. "Why didn't you ever share these stories at home?" she asked. "Why did you keep this part of your life completely separate from us?" "I tried to protect you, and also—" He hesitated. "I didn't want it to seem like I was boasting. What we did was what should have been done, nothing more." "It's funny," Emily smiled sadly. "Mom always said you had a bigger heart than you showed." I never really believed her. When the session resumed, the judge seemed to have reached a conclusion. "After reviewing the new evidence and testimonies, I find that the case against Colonel Richard Anderson was built on fraudulent grounds, with ulterior motives on the part of the accuser. The documents of the Guardians project, though they don't follow conventional bureaucratic procedures, demonstrate rigorous and transparent control of resources. The tension in the courthouse was palpable. Therefore, I order the dismissal of this case due to lack of substantial evidence. As for the Guardians project, I recommend its immediate formalization under the Department of Defense, so it can continue its work without the obstacles faced so far." A spontaneous round of applause erupted in the courtroom. The judge, rather than reprimanding, allowed the outburst for a few moments before restoring order. "Colonel Anderson, you are dismissed. This court recognizes your years of service, both in uniform and after retirement." As he left the courthouse, Richard was followed by a crowd of supporters. Journalists tried to get statements, but he maintained his usual silence. It was Michael who spoke briefly to the press. My grandfather dedicated his life to serving his country and its people. Today, justice prevailed. At home, finally away from the spotlight, Richard sank heavily into his favorite armchair. The stress of the past few days had taken its toll. Emily, who had insisted on accompanying him, made tea and sat across from him. "So now what? What happens to the project?" she asked. "It will be formalized as it should have been. So years ago, Michael offered to help with the transition." Richard smiled proudly at his grandson. "He has a good heart and a sharp mind." "Like his grandfather," Emily remarked, surprising them both with the compliment. A comfortable silence settled between them until Emily gathered the courage to ask something that had bothered her for years. "Why did you never try to find me after I left home?" Richard took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the teacup he held between his wrinkled hands. "Actually," he began hesitantly, "I tried several times." Emily looked at him, stunned. "What do you mean?" 3 months after you left, I went to your apartment. I sat in the car for an hour watching the building's entrance. I had rehearsed an entire speech." He smiled sadly. "But when I finally worked up the courage and reached your door, I heard you laughing inside. You were with friends. You seemed happy. Without me. I thought it best not to interfere." "That was my 25th birthday," Emily said, suddenly remembering. "I had the feeling someone knocked, but when I opened the door, no one was there. I came back that Christmas, left a gift with the doorman, a book of poetry your mother always wanted you to read." Emily's eyes widened. "The Walt Whitman." "I thought it was from Helen." Richard shook his head. "And the year you were promoted to manager, I attended the ceremony. I stood at the back of the room and left before you could see me." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "Why? Why did you never actually reach out?" "Because I thought I deserved your anger, that it was fair for you to move on without the weight of my failure as a father. Every time I saw how successful, independent, strong you were, it confirmed you might be better off without my interference." "Failure?" Emily was genuinely surprised. "You were never perfect, Dad, but a failure. I wasn't there when you needed me most. At school performances, childhood illnesses, the difficult teenage years. Your mother carried the burden alone. Mom never saw it as a burden." Emily smiled at the memory of her mother. "She always said you were like those heroes from old books, suffering in silence while serving greater causes." "Margaret was always too romantic," Richard commented with a nostalgic smile. "And right most of the time," Emily added. In the following days, the story of Colonel Anderson and the Guardians Project made headlines. Journalist Linda Parker published a series of articles detailing not only the project, but also the conspiracy led by Major Brian Foster to take control of the resources. A week after the trial, Richard received an unexpected call from the Department of Defense. The new secretary wanted to meet him in person to discuss formalizing the project and its potential nationwide expansion. "I don't know if I have the energy for this," Richard confessed to Helen, who visited him regularly. "Maybe it's time to pass the torch." "To whom?" his sister asked. The answer came when Emily Anderson Parker appeared for dinner that night, accompanied by Michael. "I've been thinking," she began as dessert was served. "Now that the project will be formalized, you'll need someone with administrative management experience." Richard looked at his daughter curiously. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm between jobs at the moment, and well, I have a master's in public administration that's gathering dust." She smiled timidly. "If you don't mind working with your stubborn daughter." "Emily, are you sure?" Richard asked, barely hiding his emotion. "I thought you wanted nothing to do with anything related to the army. That was before I truly understood what you were doing, before I read that diary." She took her father's hand. Mom would be proud to see the project finally recognized. Michael, watching the scene with a smile, added, "I've already scheduled interviews with over 20 families helped by the project. I want to document everything so the story isn't lost." "My God, you two have it all planned," Richard exclaimed, laughing. A month later, the Guardians Project was officially launched as an independent foundation with support from the Department of Defense. The ceremony, modest as Richard always preferred, was attended only by directly involved military personnel and beneficiary families. Among the guests was Major Brian Foster, attending as part of his probation, still visibly uncomfortable in his new position. The morning had begun with a tense conversation between Richard and Brian, their first since the trial. "Why did you want me here?" Brian asked, unable to meet the old colonel's eyes. "To humiliate me publicly?" Richard, seated in his temporary wheelchair, a concession to Emily's insistence that he not overexert himself, studied his former subordinate for a long moment. "Do you know what my biggest mistake was as your commander, Brian?" The major didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I never showed you the true purpose of what we were doing. I let you see only orders and hierarchy, never the heart behind it all. Today I want to correct that." Brian finally looked at him, wary. "I don't need your pity, Colonel." "It's not pity," Richard replied firmly. "It's a second chance. The same one I gave myself when I realized how much I'd neglected my own family because of duty. Everyone deserves at least one." Now on the small makeshift stage, Richard, still recovering from his heart condition but visibly stronger, spoke briefly. "This project was never about me or any one individual. It was about recognizing that when someone wears the uniform in service to the nation, their family serves too. And when that service takes its toll, it's our duty to ensure no one is left behind." Concluding, he formally announced his retirement from direct management, introducing Emily as the Foundation's new administrative director. The surprise and pride on her face were evident as she was called to the stage. "I promise to honor the legacy my father and mother started," she declared, her voice thick with emotion, "and to ensure the project grows without ever losing its essence, caring for our own with dignity and respect." At the end of the ceremony, as they mingled with the guests, an elderly woman timidly approached Richard. "Colonel, I don't know if you remember me. I'm Mrs. Louise, little Claire's grandmother." "Of course I remember you, Mrs. Louise," Richard said with a warm smile. "How is your son doing now?" "He's recovered and working again, thank God, and thanks to you." She clasped the old soldier's hands. "When I heard your name in the courthouse, I couldn't stay seated. That's why we all stood up. Not because of your rank or your medals, but because of what you did for us when no one else was looking." Emily, who had been listening, finally understood the meaning of that moment in the courtroom, the moment that had sparked the entire case, when the judge spoke her father's name and everyone rose in respectful silence. It wasn't the power of rank that commanded that respect, but the quiet impact of years spent helping others without seeking recognition. That night at home, Richard carefully removed his dress uniform and hung it up. It would be the last time he wore it. The medals gleamed under the soft bedroom light, each one telling a story of service and sacrifice. Emily, who had insisted on staying to make sure her father rested, watched from the doorway. "You know what's funny?" she said. "I spent years resenting this uniform, what it stood for. Now I see it was just an outward symbol of something much bigger." Richard turned to his daughter with a tired but genuine smile. "Your mother used to say uniforms are just clothes, but character stays the same, with or without them." She was right, as always. Emily stepped forward and hugged her father, a gesture that still felt new to both of them, but was becoming more natural each day. "Get some rest, Dad. Tomorrow we have a lot of work ahead." In the years that followed, the Guardians Project expanded across the country. Under Emily's leadership, and with Richard's occasional guidance, the Foundation developed new programs focused not just on emergency assistance, but also on continuing education and job reintegration for veterans. Michael completed his law degree and joined the Foundation's legal team, specializing in veterans' rights and their families. To many people's surprise, he also began a relationship with Claire, Mrs. Louise's granddaughter, who had become a volunteer at the Foundation. After learning more about her own family's history with the project, "I think our grandfather might have a heart attack when he finds out," Claire joked one afternoon, as they sorted documents for the documentary Michael was producing. "Why?" he asked, genuinely confused. "A high-ranking military grandson dating a girl from a humble family that the project helped. Sounds like a soap opera," she laughed. Michael smiled, holding her hand. "My grandfather will love it. He always said the only hierarchy that matters is the one of character." And indeed, when they finally told Richard about their relationship, The old colonel simply smiled and murmured something about closing circles and poetic justice. Michael's documentary about the project's history, titled Invisible, Guardians received national recognition and helped attract new partners and donors. One of its most moving scenes showed former beneficiaries of the project who had overcome their struggles and were now helping others in the same situation, creating a virtuous cycle of solidarity. As for Major Brian Foster, his path was more complicated. After facing disciplinary and criminal proceedings, he was convicted of document forgery and attempted fraud. Yet during the trial, he revealed himself as a broken man, unable to face the fact that his own family had been beneficiaries of the very project he had tried to destroy. "I didn't know," he confessed in his final testimony, tears streaming down his once stoic face, "when I found out about my father's treatment, that it was Anderson who—" He couldn't finish. Showing the same compassion that had guided his life, Richard intervened to reduce the sentence on the condition that Brian perform community service, ironically at the very Guardians Foundation. In the first few months, Brian worked in silence, avoiding contact with the other volunteers. It was Emily who finally broke through that barrier. "My father wasn't perfect either," she said, sitting beside him during a break. "I've learned that sometimes the hardest people to forgive are the ones who show us our own flaws." Slowly, the former major began to find redemption in the very work he had tried to destroy. Eventually, he became one of the most dedicated coordinators, specializing in helping veterans with psychological struggles, something he himself had faced in silence for years. As for the Veterans Memorial, it was finally built on the originally planned site, but with one significant change. Half the space was dedicated to a support center for veterans and their families, fulfilling Richard's original vision. On a sunny Sunday, 2 years after the trial, a small family gathering took place in Richard's backyard. Emily, her husband Robert, and Michael chatted excitedly about the foundation's new projects. Helen prepared a barbecue, occasionally scolding her brother when he tried to help too much. "You need to learn to delegate, Richard," she teased. "You can't command everything." The old soldier smiled, watching his family gathered around. His heart, though physically weaker, had never felt so full. The hardest battle of his life hadn't been on any battlefield but right there, winning back his daughter's love and respect, building a legacy that went beyond medals and ranks. When everyone sat down to eat, Emily raised her glass in a toast. "To all who serve quietly without seeking recognition or glory, and to my father, who taught me late but taught me well, that true heroism lies in the small daily acts of compassion." Richard moved, raised his glass too. The setting sun reflected in the liquid, casting little rainbows across the table. Like that courtroom years ago, everyone stood in respectful silence, not for the uniform or the medals, but for the man and his deeds. And so, one chapter closed in the old colonel's life, while another, perhaps more meaningful, began. No longer as a commander, but as a mentor and inspiration to a new generation who had learned through his example that true respect isn't demanded by authority, but earned through integrity and selfless service. The end of the story. Dear listener, what did you think of Colonel Richard's journey? Did his family find the redemption you hoped for? Leave your comment, your like, and most of all, subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories that teach us about honor and love.